Welcome back to the channel. If you've been here before, you already know that what we do here isn't simply talk about aircraft. We talk about worlds, we talk about eras, we talk about the kind of traveling that no longer exists, the kind that made you feel from the moment you stepped aboard that you had entered somewhere entirely different from ordinary life. And today, we are going to talk about something that, in many ways, is the most extraordinary story we have ever touched. Not because it succeeded, but precisely because it didn't. Let me ask you something before we begin. Have you ever wondered what it would have felt like to board an aircraft so advanced, so staggeringly beautiful, and so impossibly ahead of its time that even the people who designed it could barely believe what they were building? An aircraft that was going to fly faster than the speed of sound, carry over 300 passengers in conditions that rivaled the finest hotels in the world, cross the Atlantic in under 3 hours, and do all of this while looking like something drawn by a dreamer who had never been told that some things are simply impossible? An aircraft that was going to make the Concorde look modest by comparison? That aircraft was the Boeing 2707, and it never flew a single commercial flight. But here is what makes this story so haunting, so magnetic, and so worth your time on this quiet afternoon. The Boeing 2707 didn't fail because the dream was small. It failed because the dream was so enormous, so wildly ambitious, so breathtakingly grand, that the world simply wasn't ready for it. And in the process of trying to build it, the people behind this machine gave us one of the most revealing windows into what aviation could have become. What luxury could have meant at 30,000 feet? What the experience of flight at its absolute pinnacle in the early 1970s might have looked and felt and tasted like. So today, we are not going to talk primarily about engines or wing designs or aerodynamic formulas. We are going to climb aboard. We are going to walk through the cabin that was designed for this aircraft. We are going to sit in seats that were being sketched on drafting tables in Seattle while the whole world watched in astonishment. We are going to look out of windows that were never installed into a fuselage that was never completed. And we are going to understand, deeply and personally, why the Boeing 2707 remains, and more than 50 years later, the most magnificent aircraft that never was. Stay with me. This one is something special. To understand the Boeing 2707, you have to understand the world it was born into. And that world, in the early 1960s, was a world drunk on the future. Not cautiously optimistic about it. Drunk on it. The space race was producing miracles on a monthly basis. Television was changing what it meant to witness history. The jet age had already transformed aviation beyond recognition, and the men who ran the great American airlines, the men who ran Boeing, the men who sat in the offices of the Federal Aviation Administration, were all looking at what was happening in Britain and France and thinking the same thought. We cannot let this happen without us. What was happening in Britain and France was, of course, the Concorde. And the Concorde, as history would eventually confirm, was a genuine marvel. A slender, white, needle-nosed aircraft of almost otherworldly elegance that could fly at twice the speed of sound and carry its passengers from London to New York in just over 3 hours. The Concorde was extraordinary. It was sophisticated. It was, in its own right, an experience so exclusive and so refined that it attracted prime ministers, film stars, financiers, and royalty for over 2 decades. But in 1960s America, the Concorde wasn't seen as the gold standard. It was seen as the starting point, the challenge, the thing America needed to surpass. And the way America decided to surpass it was to think bigger, to think faster, to think more lavish, more powerful, and more breathtaking in every possible direction. This was not a modest country with modest ambitions. This was a nation that had just committed itself to landing a man on the moon, and the people designing the American Supersonic transport, the aircraft that would become the Boeing 2707, were operating with exactly that same energy. If we are going to do this, we are going to do it in a way no one has ever seen. Can you imagine what it felt like to be part of that conversation? To sit in a meeting room in Seattle and hear someone say, with complete seriousness, that America was going to build a supersonic airliner that would carry more than 300 passengers, fly at Mach 2.7, which meant nearly 3 times the speed of sound, cover the distance between New York and London in under 2.5 hours, and do all of this while offering an interior experience so refined, so spacious, and so elegantly appointed that passengers would step off at Heathrow feeling as if they had barely left the ground. That was the Boeing 2707. That was what it was supposed to be. And for a few extraordinary years in the late 1960s, it came closer to existing than most people today realize. The competition to design America's supersonic transport began formally in 1963, when President Kennedy's administration announced that the federal government would fund the development of a commercial supersonic aircraft to rival and surpass the Anglo-French Concorde. Several companies submitted proposals, but it was Boeing's design that ultimately won the government contract in 1966, and the design that Boeing put forward was, by any standard of measurement, audacious beyond description. The original Boeing 2707 concept featured a variable sweep wing. This means that the wings could actually change their shape during flight, sweeping back to a narrow delta configuration at supersonic speeds and extending forward into a more conventional swept configuration for takeoff and landing. It was a feature borrowed from military aircraft like the F-111 and the B-1 bomber. It was breathtakingly complex. It was mechanically heroic. And it was, as the engineers would eventually and painfully discover, extraordinarily difficult to make work on an aircraft of this size. But we will come to that. Right now, we need to step inside, because here is where the story becomes something entirely different from an engineering history. Here is where it becomes a story about experience, about what it was going to feel like to be a passenger on this machine. And what the designers had planned for those passengers was, by any measure, one of the most ambitious visions of luxury travel ever committed to paper. Picture this. You are at JFK Airport in the early 1970s, as the planners imagined it would be. You have a ticket on a Boeing 2707 flight to London. Your ticket cost more than an ordinary transatlantic fare, considerably more, because this is not an ordinary experience. This is the fastest, most technologically advanced, most magnificently appointed passenger aircraft ever built. You have dressed for it, because in that era you dressed for flying the way you dressed for a night at the theater. The airport has a dedicated supersonic terminal, because that too was part of the vision. A terminal designed specifically for the passengers of this aircraft, with a lounge that reflects the prestige of the journey you are about to make. You walk through the boarding gate, and you enter the aircraft through a door that is lower than you might expect, because supersonic aircraft have to manage their cross-section very carefully to reduce aerodynamic drag. But once you are inside, the sense of compression disappears, because the designers of the 2707's interior had thought about this problem very carefully indeed. The cabin is long and narrow by the standards of a wide-body jet, but it is appointed in a way that makes narrowness feel like intimacy rather than constriction. The seats are wide, the materials are exceptional, the color palette is refined and warm. There are no garish patterns, no cheap plastics, no cramped overhead bins. There is, instead, a sense that someone with genuine taste has made every decision about what you see, what you touch, and what surrounds you for the next 2.5 hours. The seating configuration that was envisioned for the Boeing 2707 was far more generous than anything you would find on a conventional subsonic airliner of the same era. The aircraft was going to carry somewhere between 200 and 250 passengers in its revised configuration, which may sound like a lot, but when you factor in the length of the fuselage and the quality of the appointments being planned, it translated into a level of personal space that today's traveler would find genuinely astonishing. There was going to be a first-class section at the front of the aircraft that featured seats wider than those of the competition, with more legroom and a level of privacy that was uncommon even on the finest transatlantic services of the day. Business-class passengers, in the middle of the aircraft, were going to have conditions that equaled or exceeded the first-class standards of most subsonic jets. This is where one begins to understand that this was a different way of traveling. Not just faster, different in kind. The thinking behind the two 707's interior was rooted in a specific philosophy, one that the airline industry in America was developing during this era with great seriousness. The philosophy was this: if a passenger is going to pay a premium to fly supersonically, the experience cannot simply be about speed. It has to be about everything. It has to be about the whole package of sensation, comfort, luxury, and prestige from the moment you sit down to the moment you land. Speed is the headline, but elegance is the promise. The windows of the Boeing 2707 were a subject of particular attention. In supersonic flight, the skin of the aircraft heats up due to friction with the air at extreme velocity. The Concorde's windows famously became warm to the touch during cruise, and passengers often pressed their palms against the glass simply to feel that remarkable warmth, that physical reminder of the extraordinary forces at work outside. The 2707 was going to fly even faster than the Concorde, and its windows were designed with this in mind. They were smaller than those of a conventional jet, again for aerodynamic and thermal reasons, but the views they framed were going to be unlike anything a passenger had ever seen from a commercial aircraft. At the cruising altitude being planned for the 2707, which was somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 feet, passengers were going to be looking down on the world from a height that commercial aviation had never routinely reached before. At that altitude, the curvature of the Earth becomes visible. Not dramatically, not as a shocking revelation, but as a gentle, undeniable arc at the edge of the world, a reminder that you are not simply traveling above the clouds, but existing, for a few hours, at the very edge of what the atmosphere can support. The sky above is not blue at that altitude. It is a deep, dark indigo, shading almost into black, because you are standing at the frontier of space. Below, the Atlantic stretches away in every direction, a vast pewter mirror under the winter sun, or a carpet of cloud formations so vast and so beautiful that they look like a landscape of their own. Can you imagine sitting in your seat, a glass of something excellent in your hand, looking out of that small oval window and seeing that? The edge of the sky above you, darkening toward black. The curve of the Earth below. The feeling of traveling so fast that the world beneath you is barely moving, because at Mach 2.7 the geography of continents becomes slow. You are not crossing an ocean. You are flying above it in a way that makes the ocean seem still, contemplative, almost irrelevant to your progress. This was what the Boeing 2707 was going to offer. Not just speed, a perspective. A relationship with the planet that no human being, unless they were an astronaut or a test pilot, had ever experienced before. And the designers were going to surround that experience with everything they could offer in terms of material comfort, refinement, and elegance. The food service on the Boeing 2707 was going to be, of necessity and by ambition, something quite remarkable. Supersonic flight creates specific challenges for food service. The flight time is so compressed that there isn't the space for a long, leisurely meal service of the kind you might have enjoyed on a 10-hour crossing by subsonic jet. The designers and the airlines who were planning to operate the 2707, and we will get to those airlines, because their enthusiasm for this aircraft was extraordinary, knew that the food service would have to be simultaneous rather than sequential, or every passenger needed to receive their meal at approximately the same time, because there simply wasn't the time to do it any other way. But the solution to that logistical challenge was not to lower the ambition of the food. It was to raise it. The meals being planned for the Boeing 2707's first-class cabin were going to be pre-plated and pre-prepared to a standard that was exceptional for aircraft catering of any era. Fresh ingredients, premium proteins, wines selected with the same care that a fine restaurant would apply to its list. The thinking was direct and logical. If this passenger is paying for speed and luxury, then every minute of the experience, including every bite of food and every sip of wine, must reflect that investment. A 2.5-hour flight was too short for a mediocre meal. It was long enough for a memorable one. The most surprising thing is that this really happened, in the planning sense. Airlines were not only expressing interest in the Boeing 2707, they were placing orders for it. Real orders, with deposits. By the time the program reached its peak, in the late 1960s, American Airlines, United Airlines, TWA, Pan American World Airways, and a number of international carriers had placed options or orders for the aircraft. Pan Am alone, under the legendary leadership of Juan Tripper, expressed interest in purchasing 15 of them. 15. The man who had introduced the jet age to the world with the Boeing 707 in 1958, and who had ushered in the wide-body era with the Boeing 747 at the end of that decade, was prepared to do it a third time with the 2707. He believed in it. He wanted it. He could see exactly how it would reshape the world of transatlantic travel, just as every previous transformation he had championed had reshaped it before. And why wouldn't he believe in it? The Boeing 2707, in its projected form, was going to be the most commercially successful supersonic aircraft ever built, because it was going to be the most accessible. Not cheap, certainly, but accessible in comparison to anything else flying at those speeds. The Concorde was going to carry 100 passengers. The Boeing 2707 was going to carry more than twice that. More passengers per flight meant lower costs per seat. Lower costs per seat meant that supersonic travel, while still premium, was not going to be exclusively for heads of state and rock legends. It was going to be for the upper-middle-class business traveler who needed to be in London for a meeting and back in New York for dinner. It was going to be for the successful professional who valued their time above almost anything else and was prepared to pay for the privilege of having more of it. This is where the Boeing 2707 becomes something more than an aviation story. It becomes a story about what America thought the future was going to look like. And that vision of the future was genuinely extraordinary. Let me take you back to the design process for a moment, because some of what happened inside Boeing during those years is remarkable in its own right. The engineers and designers working on the 2707 were dealing with problems that had never been solved before at this scale. At Mach 2.7, the skin of the aircraft heats up to temperatures that are extreme by any commercial aviation standard. The aluminum alloys used in conventional jet aircraft would have softened and deformed at those temperatures. Boeing's original design used titanium, one of the most structurally demanding materials in aerospace engineering, for large portions of the airframe. Titanium is extraordinarily strong, extraordinarily heat-resistant, and extraordinarily difficult to work with. The manufacturing techniques required to build a commercial aircraft primarily out of titanium barely existed. Boeing was going to have to invent them. And then there was the variable sweep wing. In the original 2707 design, the wings could pivot back toward the fuselage for supersonic cruise and extend outward for the lower speeds of takeoff and landing. This sounds, in principle, elegant, adaptive, responsive to the physics of flight in a beautifully logical way. In practice, the mechanism required to move those wings on an aircraft of this size and weight was extraordinarily heavy. The pivot points, the hydraulic systems, the structural reinforcements required to manage the forces involved, all of this added weight to the aircraft in a way that was beginning to threaten the economics of the whole project. More weight meant more fuel. More fuel meant lower range. Lower range meant fewer routes. Fewer routes meant fewer paying passengers. And fewer paying passengers meant a very different financial calculation from the one that had made the 2707 look so attractive to Pan Am and TWA and American Airlines. By 1969, Boeing had made a crucial decision. The variable sweep wing was abandoned. The revised 2707, which is sometimes referred to as the 2707-300, moved to a fixed delta wing configuration, similar in concept to the Concorde's wing. This was a significant redesign, but it solved many of the weight problems and simplified the structural challenges enormously. The new design was, if anything, more elegant than the original. The long, slim fuselage, the sweeping delta wing, the 4 powerful engines grouped in pairs beneath the wings and fuselage. It looked, in its drawings and models, like something between a spacecraft and a dream. It looked like the future, in the most literal and compelling sense of that word. And it came so close, so agonizingly, heartbreakingly close. Boeing had cut metal. They had begun the manufacture of 2 full-scale prototypes. The first prototype, or which would have been used for flight testing, was partially under construction at Boeing's facility in Seattle. The second prototype was also beginning to take shape. There were firm orders and options for more than 100 aircraft from airlines around the world. The FAA was deeply invested in the program. The Nixon administration had inherited the project from its predecessors and was, initially, supportive of continuing it. And then the world changed. Or rather, several worlds changed at once, and they changed in ways that the Boeing 2707 simply could not survive. The first thing that changed was the environment. Not the physical environment, though that was part of it, but the cultural environment around it. The late 1960s and early 1970s were years of powerful and growing environmental consciousness. The sonic boom that a supersonic aircraft produces when it exceeds the speed of sound is not a gentle sound. It is a sudden, sharp, explosive crack that can shatter windows, disturb livestock, wake sleeping children, and generate the kind of visceral public anger that politicians find very difficult to ignore. The Concorde was already generating controversy over this issue, both in Europe and in the United States. Opponents of the SST program, as it was known, began organizing with great effectiveness, and their central argument was simple. Do you want this boom cracking over your house every time one of these aircraft crosses your country? The answer, as it turned out, was no. The supersonic transport was restricted, in the United States, to flying at supersonic speeds only over the ocean. This was a significant limitation. It meant that the aircraft's speed advantage was only fully realized on transoceanic routes. Domestic supersonic travel, which had been part of the original vision, was essentially off the table. This reduced the commercial attractiveness of the aircraft in ways that were economically significant. The second thing that changed was the economy. The late 1960s and early 1970s were not kind to the American economy. Inflation was rising. The cost of the Vietnam War was straining federal budgets, and the cost of the Boeing 2707 program had been rising steadily, for all the reasons we have already discussed. The titanium manufacturing challenges, the weight problems, the enormous complexity of building something that had never been built before. The government had already spent approximately $1 billion on the program, an enormous sum for that era. Projections for the total development cost were continuing to climb. The third thing that changed was the politics. In 1971, the United States Senate voted to terminate federal funding for the supersonic transport program. The vote was close. It was 71 to 51 against. But it was decisive. Without federal funding, Boeing could not continue the program on its own, not at that scale, not with those development costs, not with those unresolved technical challenges. The construction of the 2 prototypes was halted. The partially built airframes were eventually scrapped. The engineers were reassigned. The orders and options placed by the airlines expired without being exercised, and the Boeing 2707 was over, just like that. After years of extraordinary work, extraordinary ambition, extraordinary imagination, and extraordinary expenditure, the program ended in a Senate vote. And the future that had been so carefully, so lovingly, so passionately designed never arrived. But here is what I want you to sit with for a moment, because this is the part of the story that I find most extraordinary. When the Boeing 2707 program was cancelled, the interior design work had already been done. The cabin layouts had been drawn, the seat specifications had been written. The food service concepts had been developed, the window designs had been finalized, the color palettes had been chosen, the materials had been specified. And there were people at Boeing and at the major airlines who had devoted years of their professional lives to imagining, in extraordinary detail, what it was going to feel like to sit inside this aircraft at 65,000 feet, traveling at nearly 2,000 miles per hour, and have the finest meal they had ever eaten in the sky. All of that work, all of that vision, all of that care and intelligence and creative energy spent on an experience that was never going to happen, that would never be tasted or seen or felt by a single paying passenger. It is one of the great unresolved losses in the history of luxury travel. Let me take you one more time into the cabin that was designed but never built, because I want you to feel it. I want you to understand what was lost. You are in the first-class section of a Boeing 2707, and somewhere over the mid-Atlantic, at an altitude of 64,000 feet. It is 7 in the morning in London and 2 in the morning in New York. But your body hasn't decided what time it is yet. And for the next 2 hours, it doesn't need to. The cabin is quiet. The 4 engines, powerful as they are well behind you and well below the fuselage, and at cruise the sound inside the cabin was projected to be genuinely low, comparable to the better subsonic jets of the era. There is no turbulence at this altitude. The air above the troposphere is smooth and cold and still, and the aircraft moves through it with the calm authority of something that belongs there. The seat beneath you is wide. It is upholstered in a material that was typical of first-class aviation design in the early 1970s. The best leathers are the finest wool fabrics, the kind of materials that were being chosen by people who understood that a passenger's relationship with their seat was a physical and psychological one, that the way a surface feels against your skin affects how you feel about your whole journey. The armrests are solid and wide, there is a footrest, the recline is generous. Next to you, the seat beside you is empty, because first class on this aircraft was designed with exactly that kind of spacing in mind, the kind that makes you feel that the world has been temporarily suspended and replaced with something much calmer. The cabin crew, dressed in the airline uniforms that were already, by this era, being designed by the great couturiers of Paris and New York, moves through the cabin with the efficiency and discretion that supersonic service demands. There is no time to dawdle, but there is also no sense of rush. These men and women are professionals in the deepest sense of the word, trained not just in safety, but in service, in hospitality, in the art of making a person feel genuinely cared for in a pressurized tube at the edge of the stratosphere. Your meal arrives. It is not a box. It is not a tray of assembled components. It is a plate, a real plate, bearing food that has been prepared with genuine care. The protein is excellent. There is a small salad with a proper dressing. The bread is real. The wine, poured carefully into a proper glass, is one that a ground-level sommelier would be pleased to serve. You eat slowly, because the flight is short and because this is worth savoring, and because the act of eating well at this altitude, moving at this speed, with that view outside your window, feels like something that demands your full attention. And then, when the meal is done and cleared away with the same quiet efficiency with which it arrived, you turn to the window. And there it is, the world at the edge of the sky. Below you, the Atlantic in its vastness. Above you, the sky beginning its transition from the deep, saturated blue of high altitude toward something darker, something that is almost not sky at all, but the first whisper of the universe beyond. The sunlight at this altitude is extraordinary. There are no clouds to soften it, no atmosphere thick enough to scatter it in the usual ways. It comes at you directly, sharply, brilliantly, and the shadows it casts are stark and clean and unlike anything you have ever seen from a lower altitude. You have been flying for about an hour. In another hour, roughly, you will begin your descent. And as you descend, as the aircraft slows from its supersonic cruise to the subsonic speeds required for landing approach, you will feel it. Not dramatically, not with any discomfort, but as a gentle shift in the quality of your movement through the air, a subtle change in the note of the engines, a slight adjustment in the pressure that the world makes upon your senses. You are coming back. From that extraordinary, temporary, unrepeatable perch at the top of the world, you are coming back down to it. And Heathrow will be there, and London will be there, and it will be, impossibly, still the same morning in which you left New York. Less than 3 hours will have passed. You will step off this aircraft at Heathrow, and the whole vast Atlantic will be behind you, as if it were a garden you had crossed, and there will be a moment, standing in the arrivals hall with your bag in your hand, when the sheer improbability of what you have just experienced will hit you with something close to joy. This was the promise of the Boeing 2707. Not just speed, not just luxury. The feeling of having done something extraordinary. The feeling that travel, at its very best, is not about getting somewhere, but about the quality of the transformation that happens between leaving and arriving. Now I want to talk about the people who are going to fly this aircraft, because the Boeing 2707 was not designed, as the Concorde largely was, for a narrow elite of rock stars and heads of government. It was designed for the successful, and the ambitious, the time-conscious professional class that was emerging in America and in the world during the 1960s and 70s, the managing director of a major company, the senior partner of a law firm, the senior executive of an international bank, the person for whom time was the single most precious commodity, and who had both the means and the motivation to buy more of it. These were people who already knew how to travel well. They had flown the 707 and the DC-8 in first class. Some of them had flown the 747, which was just entering service at the same time the 2707 program was reaching its peak, and which offered a completely different kind of luxury, the luxury of space and grandeur, the upper deck with its piano bar, the lounges, the wide seats, the sense of being aboard something oceanic and enormous. These were discerning travelers. They had opinions about seat width and meal quality and the weight of a wine glass. They were not going to be impressed by mere speed if everything else was mediocre. The airlines understood this perfectly. Pan Am, which was then the prestige carrier of the world, the airline that more than any other had defined what international first-class air travel could be, was planning the 2707's first-class cabin with exactly this passenger in mind. Not the wealthiest person in the world, the most demanding, the most experienced, the person who had flown everything and expected the best from whatever they were about to board. It is worth noting that this was also the golden age of the airline passenger as a kind of cultural archetype. The man in the perfectly cut suit boarding a transatlantic flight with a briefcase and a glass of something in his hand. The woman in the silk blouse and the good jewelry who knew exactly which seat she wanted and exactly how she wanted her martini made. These were not figures of satire. They were real people, shaped by a real culture, living in a world where flying well was considered a legitimate form of self-expression, and where the major airlines competed for their loyalty with a seriousness and a creativity that today's industry has largely abandoned. For these passengers, the Boeing 2707 was not merely an attractive option. It was the logical culmination of everything aviation had been building toward: faster, more comfortable, more refined, more exclusive, more extraordinary. The 2707 was going to be the aircraft that completed the arc of the jet age's first chapter and opened the second, the supersonic chapter, on terms that these passengers were going to recognize and embrace and celebrate. And that is perhaps why its cancellation felt so personal to so many people in the aviation world. Not just the engineers and the executives and the airline planners, but the travelers themselves, the people who had been reading about it in the airline magazines, in the business press, in the travel columns of newspapers, the people who had, perhaps in some part of their imagination, already boarded it, already tasted that meal, already looked out that window, already felt that subtle shift as the aircraft slowed and the Atlantic lay behind them and London reached up to receive them. The Boeing 2707's cancellation left a gap in aviation history that has never been fully filled. The Concorde went on to fly for 27 years, a genuine wonder, a genuine achievement, a genuinely extraordinary experience for everyone privileged enough to fly on it. But the Concorde was always a small aircraft, carrying small numbers of passengers at prices that remained extraordinary by any standard. It was the elite option. It was never the democratic supersonic dream that the 2707 had been designed to represent. What might have been different if the 2707 had flown? It is a question that aviation historians return to regularly, and the answers are always fascinating. If the program had been completed, if those two prototypes had flown and the development challenges had been overcome, as they surely would have been given enough time and money, then the supersonic transport might have become a genuine fixture of transatlantic travel by the late 1970s. Faster, more efficient, more economical in use than the Concorde, carrying 3 times as many passengers, serving a far larger market. The economics of supersonic travel would have been transformed. The experience of crossing the Atlantic would have been transformed. Consider what the 1980s might have looked like in this alternative history. A generation of business travelers for whom supersonic transatlantic crossing was not an extraordinary luxury, but a regular professional tool. A generation of airline designers who had spent 2 decades refining and perfecting the supersonic passenger experience. So that by 1985 or 1990, the interior of a Boeing 2707 was as polished and impeccable as the finest transatlantic first class in history. A generation of chefs and sommeliers and service professionals who had made the 2.5-hour flight the most intensely curated hospitality experience in aviation. We didn't get that. We got the oil crisis of 1973, which made fuel efficiency the dominant concern of the whole industry and pushed supersonic development even further into the background. We got the deregulation of the American airline industry in 1978, which shifted the competitive focus from quality to price and began the long, slow dismantling of the golden age cabin experience that the 2707 had been designed to crown. We got a world in which the economics of aviation gradually squeezed out the extravagance, the elegance, and the ambition that had characterized the first 30 years of the jet age. The Boeing 2707 was not just an aircraft that failed to get built. It was the last great statement of a particular philosophy of travel, the philosophy that held that the journey was as important as the destination, that the experience of being in the air was worth investing in, celebrating, and making extraordinary. That speed and luxury were not in conflict, but were natural partners, 2 aspects of the same deep human desire to move through the world in ways that felt worthy of the world's grandeur. After the 2707, that philosophy didn't disappear entirely. The Concorde kept it alive, in its restricted and exclusive way, and some of the finest first-class cabins of the 1980s and 90s echoed it. The great Singapore Airlines first-class suite of the 2000s gave it a contemporary form. There are aircraft flying today whose upper-deck first-class suites, with their closing doors and double beds and restaurant-quality catering, carry some DNA from the vision that was being drafted on those Seattle drawing boards in 1968. But nothing has ever quite recaptured the ambition of the 2707, the idea that you could carry 250 passengers at nearly 3 times the speed of sound in conditions that would have made a luxury hotelier feel proud. The idea that speed and scale and elegance were not competing values, but could be woven together into something entirely new, and something that redefined not just how you got somewhere, but what it meant to get there. There are still people alive today who worked on the Boeing 2707 program, engineers in their 80s and 90s who remember the weight of titanium sheets and the complexity of variable sweep wing mechanisms and the painstaking calculations required to design an aircraft skin that could withstand 2,000 miles per hour without failure. Some of them have spoken about that time with an emotion that goes well beyond professional pride. They speak about it the way people speak about a love that was real and complete, but did not survive. Not with bitterness necessarily, but with a kind of ache, the particular grief of having worked towards something magnificent and seen it end before it could show the world what it was capable of. Or there is something deeply moving about that, about the human investment in an idea so large and so beautiful that its failure is not merely a business setback or a technical disappointment, but something closer to a loss of a possible world. Because that is what the Boeing 2707 was. A possible world. A version of the future in which human beings crossed oceans in the time it takes to watch a film, surrounded by comfort and elegance and the extraordinary view from the top of the sky, arriving refreshed and barely displaced from the morning in which they had departed. That world was possible. It was being built. The metal was being cut. The seats were being designed. The menus were being written. The airlines were counting the gates they were going to need. And then it was gone. Not because it was impossible, but because the moment passed, and the money dried up, and the politics shifted, and the world moved in a different direction. I want to leave you with one image. It is not a photograph, because the photographs of what I am about to describe don't quite exist in the way I want to show you. But close your eyes for a moment or keep them open and try to see this. It is 1973. The Boeing 2707 has been cancelled for 2 years. At Boeing's facility in Seattle, the partially completed prototypes are in the process of being dismantled. Sections of fuselage that were never going to be finished are being cut apart. The titanium skin panels, each one the product of engineering techniques that barely existed before this program demanded them, are being removed and catalogued and, in many cases, simply discarded. The great variable sweep wing mechanism that had been at the center of the original design, so audacious and so troubled, exists only in drawings and scale models and in the memories of the people who tried to make it work. In a drawer somewhere, or in a filing cabinet, or in a box in someone's office, there are interior design proposals for a cabin that will never be built. Color swatches, seat specifications, sample menus, wine lists, the details of an experience that would have been, for the people who were going to have it, one of the finest hours of their traveling lives. And outside the factory, the world is moving on. The 1973 oil crisis is about to arrive and change everything about aviation economics. The Concorde is still being developed and will enter service in 3 years. Beautiful and fast and narrow and exclusive. The Boeing 747 is filling its wide aisles with hundreds of passengers and making the transatlantic crossing genuinely affordable for the first time. The future is arriving, but it is a different future from the one that was drawn on these drawing boards, a future in which efficiency matters more than elegance, and in which the seat next to you is very unlikely to be empty. That is the world we have been living in ever since. And it is a world with many virtues. Aviation has become accessible to an extraordinary degree. Hundreds of millions of people fly every year who could never have dreamed of flying in the 1960s. The democratization of flight is a genuine and profound achievement, and it would be wrong to dismiss it. But something was lost too. Something in the vision of what flight could be, what it could feel like, what it could mean to the person in the seat, looking out the window, at the edge of the sky. The Boeing 2707 represented the highest point of a particular arc in aviation's ambition. The point at which speed and luxury and scale and elegance were all going to come together in a single machine that embodied everything the jet age had been reaching toward. And it is still up there, in a sense, unfinished, circling in the imagination, waiting for the world to be ready for it. I wonder sometimes what it would have been like. Not abstractly, specifically. What would it have been like to be the first passenger to board a Boeing 2707 on a commercial flight? To sit in that seat, in that cabin, with that meal on the way and that view at your window, and know that you were doing something that had never been done before, that you were traveling in a way that no human being had traveled before you, not an astronaut, not a test pilot, just a person with a ticket, and the good fortune to be alive at the moment the future arrived. We never got to be that person, but we can imagine it. And sometimes imagining something wonderful is its own form of travel. Thank you for joining me on this one. If you made it here, you already know that this channel is not for people who want to rush through history. It is for people who want to sit with it for a while, who want to feel the weight of what was lost and the wonder of what was attempted. If that is you, then this is your place, and I am genuinely glad you are here. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Because we are a community here, and the conversations in the comments are always one of the best parts of what we do together. If the Boeing 2707 had flown, if that first commercial supersonic service had departed JFK for Heathrow on a bright autumn morning in 1975, which part of the experience would you have found most extraordinary? The view from 65,000 feet, with the curve of the Earth visible and the sky darkening toward space above you. The meal service designed to deliver genuine quality in under 2.5 hours. The sheer sensation of knowing that you were traveling at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. Or simply the privilege of being part of an era in which human beings still believed that the future, if you reached for it hard enough, would be more beautiful than anything that had come before? Tell me in the comments. I read them all, and I find in them, regularly, the kind of thoughtful, historically minded perspective that reminds me why I make these videos in the first place. If you are new here, and this is the first time you have spent half an hour traveling through aviation history with me, please consider subscribing. There is a great deal more of this to come. Aircraft that redefined elegance, cabins that resembled ballrooms, meals that belonged in restaurants, views that belonged in dreams. We have barely scratched the surface of what aviation, at its most extraordinary, once was, and what it still might inspire us to imagine. Share this video with someone who loves history, who loves the story of human ambition at its most spectacular, who loves the particular melancholy of a dream that came breathtakingly close to the world, and then, just at the last moment, didn't quite touch it. The Boeing 2707 never flew, but in some important sense, it is still flying. Up there, in the imagination, at 65,000 feet, moving at Mach 2.7, with a glass of excellent wine and the curve of the Earth visible through the window, and 2.5 hours between you and London, and all the wonder in the world still possible. Safe travels, as always. And I will see you on the next flight.